Hi there, I'm sitting here in the Center for Interactive Research on Sustainability with Professor John Robinson, who is a professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability and the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia. I think a lot of people would come to this conversation about climate change and sustainability feeling a bit overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. What would you say to those people?
Well, it is overwhelming, for sure, but I would say to them that part of the reason they may feel that is a particular kind of narrative about the future that they've internalized because they've had basically through their whole life taught to them in school and by our culture at large. And that's a narrative that says human activity is inherently damaging. It's inherently destructive. And so we have to find some way to reduce that destruction, to cut back, to reduce harm, to limit damage, to reduce activity, maybe to sacrifice. This is a very common story in our culture. And if that's the story, then of course it's overwhelming. It's not just overwhelming, it's not solvable. Because that kind of harm reduction agenda, which comes from a whole history of environmental concern, lots of good science about constraints and limits, nevertheless gives rise to this storyline, which in the end is overwhelming and also unproductive. I think there's two big reasons that doesn't work as a sort of narrative of how we relate to our world around us. The first is, obviously, it's not motivating, right? People don't jump on the bandwagon of sacrifice. They don't leap to the front of the line of cutting back and doing without. It just doesn't get a lot of positive response. And that's a huge problem because this is a global issue of really big consequence. If we don't find a way to engage basically everyone in the planet on this problem over the next 50 years, we will fail. Because without social license and approval of the kinds of measures that will probably be required, it's not going to happen. So that's a big problem with that narrative. The other big problem with the narrative is in some ways even more interesting because I would argue that story about cutting back and doing without doesn't go far enough anyway. It's not good enough to just reduce damage. We have to find ways to make things better, not just less bad. So this leads us to our idea of what we call regenerative sustainability, which is a very simple concept. It's human activity that doesn't have to be minimized because it's so bad. It's human activity that actually improves environmental and human well-being. That's it. Can we do things that will improve both environmental and human well-being? Can we have regenerative buildings? We think we've built one, the one we're sitting in right now. Can we have regenerative neighborhoods? Could we have regenerative industrial processes and regenerative transportation systems? Regenerative cities? Could a city be actually contributing to net positive outcomes in human and environmental terms? That's, I think, the real question, because it's always better to be regenerative than to just reduce damage. It's always better to create positive outcomes and have less negative outcomes.
It seems to me, and perhaps many of the students of this course would agree, that climate change is a very polarizing issue, that it's been taken up by the media and in policy-making circles in seemingly irreconcilable ways. It's hard to bring the different positions around the table together to navigate the future and come up with solutions. So these issues of framing and the role of science in climate change, are these the underpinnings of that polarization to you, or what do you think the source is there?
Absolutely. If the problem is fundamentally a scientific one, then you need science to answer it. And if you try to use science to answer a bunch of normative ethical problems, you run into difficulties. And one of those difficulties is the assumption that there's a single right answer to these problems, and that we just have to find it out. And so this leads to this incredible kind of polarization of different sides who claim that they have the single truth to the scientific problem of climate change. Once we recognize that these are fundamentally normative ethical principles that are value-laden very deeply, then it becomes more understandable how this kind of process of disagreement emerges. It's not that the science itself is fundamentally at issue. My reading of it after years of being a lead author in 3 IPCC assessment reports is there's a greater degree of scientific consensus on this issue than any other environmental issue I know. It's far greater. Ironically, however, exactly what has made that consensus so strong is what has contributed deeply to the public perception of uncertainty.
So then how do we take as our starting point the fact that this is complex, value-laden, with scientific roots, certainly, and the need for good science on these issues, but also deeply political and deeply social? How do we move forward from there, convene a conversation, and spark action?
I think the answer is stepping outside IPCC itself, and more generally for society, is to recognize that what we're talking about is what kind of world we want to live in. That's what we're talking about. There's huge consequences of different courses of action, different choices we make. And we better recognize that that is the level at which we are making the choices. It isn't about finding the truth and then we know the answer and know what to do. It's about deciding which consequences and which outcomes we want to try to achieve and we're willing to accept. We need local innovation, massive innovation, different experiments, and they have to happen at a scale people can deal with. But the crucial thing about climate change is that the consequences are global, and so we will be influenced by what happens globally. This is about what kind of world we want to live in, which has many more dimensions than climate change adaptation and mitigation. Moreover, we know from the literature that if we get into a sort of world that is inherently high emission, we just can't get to our climate change goals with climate policy. Climate policy alone will not get us there. We have to actually change the world we're getting into. And what this means, I think, is sustainability is more important for climate change than climate policy at some level in the long term. If we don't change our development paths such that we are in an inherently low emission and highly adaptive world, we're just not going to be able to achieve the kind of climate results we want through climate policy. In the end, it's about the underlying socioeconomic development pathway that will determine whether that community, that region, that country, and our planet are able to reach, desirable outcomes in terms of climate change.
So if I were to stand on the street corner in my neighborhood and look around me, what evidence would I see of the development path? What does that look like in a neighborhood?
I think the problem with the term development path is very abstract. And mitigation, you can say emissions and point to your furnace. I think development path is the landscape, it's the streetscape, it's the housing mix, it's the type of vehicles, it's what kind of jobs there are, it's what the income distribution is in that community. So it's hard because it's everything, right? But that's, I think, what we need to start grappling with. These are complex questions. We have to start to say, what is the difference between a sustainable world and an unsustainable world, between a sustainable city and an unsustainable city? What's the mix of interconnected factors that give rise to more resilient communities, to communities that are lower emission? And it isn't a simple thing. It isn't just, I'm a big fan of the carbon tax, but it's not just putting a carbon tax on. It's not just this policy instrument or a regulation here. It's about creating the world we want to live in, the kind of neighborhood we want our kids to grow up in. That's the development path question. If the old expression, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, well, we have to have a wider toolkit. And so learning how to deal with complexity is actually part of the skill set we should be teaching at the university. And part of the skill set we should be asking our politicians to demonstrate is that they're not single issue politicians, that they're actually, or decision makers in business, that they're actually able to work across in a kind of horizontal way.
So if we look around our communities then, what do we find? What are those exciting, tangible examples that people can look to for inspiration, and how transformative do you think those examples are?
I think, there's an example very close to my heart because I've been very involved in it for a long time, and that's our attempt at UBC to build a building that would be regenerative, that is net positive in both environmental and human terms. In other words, a building that would improve environmental well-being and human well-being at the same time. And that's where we're sitting today. So it exists, it's operating. So there's an example. We think buildings can indeed be regenerative. The question is, can a community be regenerative? And if you look around BC, we've just been doing some work on BC municipalities and other communities in their response to provincial climate policy. We have sort of the only serious carbon tax in North America here in BC, and it together with a bunch of other policies have led to the 172 municipalities of BC being little test beds, little sites of innovation. And in the 11 case studies that we developed about that, we find some really exciting developments that are typically go beyond, even though they're a response to climate change policy, and really mitigation is the driver here from the provincial point of view, nevertheless, they often represent a much broader approach that involves community engagement processes of various kinds, participatory processes. It involves reaching out to alternative sources of energy like wind farms or whatever it might be, energy demand side measures, but also community development measures. We live in highly path-dependent worlds where there's a lot of lock-in effects. And so we're on what is typically a very unsustainable development path, mainly because the issues of sustainability weren't part of any of the decisions that created that pathway and built all that inertia. So these little examples that I'm talking about are these sort of alternative views coming to fruition. I'm old enough to remember when you couldn't look around the world and see thousands or hundreds of examples of exciting innovation for sustainability. So I'm hopeful that this is actually part of a larger process. It's an open question. You know, who knows? Will we react quickly enough to avoid really significant climate impacts? I don't know. I think our chance of avoiding a 2-degree increase is almost negligible now. 2 degrees looks worse than it looked 5 years ago in terms of the actual impacts it's going to have. On the other hand, I think we are in these kind of highly adaptive systems, and we will, one way or the other, come to terms with those impacts and start to make changes. And those might turn out to be very unhappy futures or not. I think it's still an open question.